One of the areas of Latin America that is going to become the most important for JFK is the island nation of Cuba. In 1959, the existing government of Cuba, which had been ruled by a man named Fulgencio Batista, was overthrown by a man calling himself a communist by the name of Fidel Castro. This really concerned the U.S. because the island nation of Cuba is only 90 miles off the coast of Florida. So communism had now spread to essentially our backyard. Now, what had happened was this happened all during Eisenhower's regime. Well, Eisenhower had promised some revolutionaries in Cuba to help to get rid of Castro. JFK therefore inherited this promise and this whole problem. And here you can see Castro and a couple of signs, protesting, "Watch out, JFK." So what had happened was Eisenhower had issued orders to the CIA to help these group of revolutionaries to overthrow Castro by doing a land and sea invasion at what was going to be called the Bay of Pigs. And this was supposed to happen in 1961. Well, JFK gets elected in 1960, so come 1961, JFK is told of this plan, and he is expected to follow through with it. He approved of the idea, but he was leery of risking U.S. lives in essentially a civil war. So he was kind of wishy-washy because he really didn't want to risk lives, but he didn't really want communism to spread. So he was really torn what to do. So basically what he does is at the last minute, he decides that he's not going to give the U.S. air support. But he doesn't tell the revolutionaries in enough time. So the revolutionaries show up expecting a huge Air Force presence from America. We're not there, and as a result, the revolutionaries are captured and many of them slaughtered, the rest caught and taken into capture. And the rebels are captured in about 72 hours. The survivors were very quick to point their fingers at the U.S. and say, JFK, you're horrible, blah, 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 and all this stuff. So he looked really bad to the anti-Castros. In terms of the people who supported Castro, our cover was blown because the revolutionaries very outwardly were saying, the U.S. had said that they were going to help and they didn't show up. And so now the people who supported Castro looked at us badly because we had considered invading the island. And so really from either side, we looked really bad. A U.S. journalist described it as, "We looked like fools to our friends, rascals to our enemies, and incompetents to the rest of the rest." So this is Cuba, you can see, and here are some of the revolutionaries, and Castro is in the top left picture. So this is a disaster. The Bay of Pigs disaster is, a huge embarrassment for the Kennedy administration. Castro also is going to be really worried at this point. He's fearful that the U.S. is out to get him, so he's going to start looking for an ally, using the whole idea of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The most obvious ally for Castro becomes Russia, led by Khrushchev. So Russia and Castro are now going to team up. Because Russia liked this deal. This put them really close to the U.S., so they'd be nice and nearby if they ever wanted to launch an attack. Publicly, JFK will take the full blame. He says it's all his fault. He should have communicated more clearly. He admits a whole bunch of things. But in reality, behind closed doors, he privately is going to blame this man here, who is the head of the CIA. His name is Allen Dulles. He says that Dulles was out to get him and didn't give him good information and didn't present other options. And he winds up firing Dulles from the CIA. And conspiracy theorists sometimes will point to Dulles as a man who would be potentially involved in the assassination of JFK. That I'll leave up to you to decide. Germany is the other country that is vital to JFK's foreign policy concerns. After the Bay of Pigs in particular, Khrushchev looks at JFK as being weak, ineffective in the fight against communism, and so Khrushchev is going to decide to try to capitalize on this, and he winds up issuing an ultimatum. In June of '61, just a couple months after the failed Bay of Pigs, USA, Britain, and France were basically asked by Khrushchev, but almost demanded, to recognize the sovereignty of communist East Germany and remove all military troops from West Berlin. Basically, he was trying to take over the entire city of Berlin even though 20 years earlier we had worked out this agreement that we would split it. JFK's worried. He's like, we can't lose West Berlin. At least we have a little bit of a stronghold of democracy in the middle of this country of East Germany. Um, he wasn't willing to go to the war over the point. He didn't want to declare war on East Germany. He didn't want to declare war on the Soviet Union. But he knew that if he gave up the area of control that we had in West Berlin, it would make us look even more weak. And this was one thing that he was not willing to do. So, in mid-August, in order to prove his point further, Khrushchev is going to order that East Germany build a barbed wire fence around itself in order to cut off traffic between East and West Germany. JFK's response is going to send in more troops. Just send them in and hope for this to end. As the US and Soviet troops stared at each other through this barbed wire, it became clear that the Soviet aim had actually been to stop the mass immigration of East Germans to the West. East Germans were not happy with their living conditions for the most part. I mean, many of them had been cut off from family and friends. Travel between the East and West had been very hard. The East was suffering economically while the West was beginning to prosper. The West had, the allies of Britain and France and the US, and we were letting them relatively self-govern while the eastern portion was being ruled rather tyrannically by the Soviet Union. So in a lot of ways, the East was suffering and the West was good, so people in the East were leaving. And that was the true reason that the barbed wire was put up, but Khrushchev's going to say he does it to keep the infidels of the US away. Things are going to calm down once our troops get there. We kind of square off, and Khrushchev sees that we're not actually fighting. We're just standing there are you going to do anything else? Are you just building this little barbed wire fence? Because if that's the case, we'll help you build a fence. So eventually the barbed wire fence is replaced with a giant concrete barrier that had watchtowers and ditches that went all the way around. And this actually became known as the Berlin Wall. And it's going to stand until the end of the 1980s. And it almost becomes the physical embodiment of that Iron Curtain that Winston Churchill had warned about a decade earlier. And here you can see, a little girl standing at the wall. JFK is going to make a speech at one point. He stands on the wall or next to it, and he says, I'm sorry that this is happening to you guys. I'm going to keep an eye out for you. I consider myself a Berliner. Of course, notoriety. He says that he doesn't speak fluent German, and so he winds up actually calling himself a jelly donut, but his heart was in the right place. For the next 20 years, the wall is going to stand basically as the symbol, as the actual concrete symbol of the division between the U.S. and the USSR. And I gave you some links there if you're interested in watching, JFK call himself a jelly donut, as well as just a random footage of the wall. And here's a diagram so you can see. It's not just there's a little tiny wall. There's lots of layers to this. The concrete, the barbed wire, the watchtowers, the ditches, all these types of things. And if you speak German, this probably means even more to you. So after the Bay of Pigs failed, we looked weak. After the Berlin Wall, we looked kind of strong. Khrushchev wanted to get his stronghold back. So Khrushchev decides, okay, let's go back to Cuba. Let's focus our attention there because we had some success there. So as the tensions eased in Germany, Cuba heats back up. What happens is that Cuba and Russia negotiate an agreement to allow the Soviet Union to build nuclear warheads pointed at the U.S. within the island nation. Now, we had been monitoring Cuba for years. We didn't trust them. We didn't know a lot about them other than that our organized mobs had been running casinos there. And so we had a U-2 spy plane that flew over the island, and they were always doing this, always flying over, taking pictures. Well, on October 14th, 1962, a U-2 spy plane flew over, took pictures, and we could see these nuclear missiles that were being built up. And JFK at this point is forced to respond because nuclear missiles pointed at the U.S. 90 miles away is not something you can ignore. So on October 22nd, JFK is going to make a really famous televised speech where he basically says that he is going to place an embargo on Cuba where any ship headed towards Cuba is going to be turned back by any means necessary. And this is to prevent specifically the Soviet Union from bringing the needed materials to finish the nuclear warhead construction. He's also going to demand that the Soviet Union remove these missiles. Here you can see the U-2 spy plane image where you can see the missiles being built. And if these missiles had been launched, this is the radius of what would have been hit. So you can see that most of the US would have been affected either by the fallout or by the immediate effect of the missile itself. At this point, when he makes this speech, the world kind of starts to hold its breath. It gets to the point where most people thought we were on the brink of nuclear war, and to this day, many countries consider this the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. At one point, a Soviet ship was headed towards the blockade line, and it finally stopped at the last second. There was an incident where another boat was coming close, and we fired across its bow to, its bow to tell it to turn around, and it does. So it's so close, but finally, after 13 days, which is a pretty famous movie, and there's the link for it if you're curious, after 13 days, the Soviets backed down and they agreed to remove their missiles. And this took a lot of negotiations from JFK and his brother Bobby, the two of them kind of working together. A lot of it's secret trade and agreement. And the idea was that the agreement finally made was the Soviet Union would remove their missiles from Cuba in exchange for us removing our missiles that we had in foreign sites nearby Russia, particularly in Turkey. We didn't actually do that right away, but we do eventually do it. And this ends on October 28th. And the famous quote from this time period is that we were eyeball to nuclear war, and the other fellow just blinked. We made them back down. This is said by Secretary of State Dean Rusk. After realizing how close we came to nuclear war, both us and the USSR, I don't know why I have an extra S there, realized we really needed to calm down a little bit. Things were getting a little out of hand. The threat of nuclear war is pretty intense. And so we began negotiations to agree to not use nuclear weaponry. And so we're all going to sign, the US, the USSR, and Great Britain are all going to sign the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, which we say will end the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere as well as in underwater. And we also create a hotline so that us and the USSR could call each other directly to try to negotiate more peacefully without even having to go through the United Nations. And here you can see the drastic cut down in the number of worldwide nuclear testings that happen. In terms of JFK as president, in general, he was a totally different type of president than we were used to. He was young, and this is a big key. I mean, it doesn't seem like it, but here you've got this young, rich, relatively attractive compared to other presidents. So give me this break. Got good charisma, had a lot of really famous friends. His wife was considered pretty. We just don't need to get too much into Jackie. She was well cultured. She spoke different languages. And then they had these kids that were, cute and adorable, and the country watched them grow up. And so it's like all this vibrancy was breathed back into the White House that for years had had, kind of old, staunch people in charge. And so it was like this breath of fresh air that helped to revitalize America's fascination with the presidency and the White House. In particular, he appealed to the young people. The young people of the country really looked up to him and said, hey, if he's young and he's doing all this, what can we do? And that's why he even said in his inauguration address, and so my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And it was often, this was really inspirational. There's a guy who joined the Peace Corps who said, I've never done anything political, patriotic, or unselfish because nobody ever asked me to. Kennedy asked. And so this was really a big motivation because you've got this man out there really trying to inspire people to work hard. It's important to note that he was skillful in creating this image. It was clearly not 100%. He had severe back pains. He cheated on his wife. He had some personal afflictions that make him a very flawed individual indeed. His brother even said that at least one half of the days that he spent on this earth were days of intense physical pain, but most people didn't know this. So a lot of what the public saw was this facade of youth and strength, but it was enough to motivate an entire generation of people.